Alright guys, so in this video we're going to be covering Chapter 15, Objective 1, and Chapter 15 is our last and final chapter for A&P 1. We've got 9 objectives, but we're going to be covering them a little bit differently in that we're going to look at 1, and then we're going to look at 2 through 5, and then we're going to look at 6 through 9 together. Before we get into Objective 1, I just want to do a little bit of review. So hopefully we know from previous chapters that the nervous system can be divided into different divisions, and so we've actually covered some of these divisions pretty heavily. Like in Chapter 13 we covered the main parts of the central nervous system, we covered the parts of the brain, and we've talked about the spinal cord. We've also touched a little bit on the peripheral nervous system. We looked at cranial and spinal nerves. So these are your two main divisions of the nervous system. We've got our brain and spinal cord, and then the nerves that come off of them and go to the rest of the body. And as you can see that they communicate back and forth. Now the peripheral nervous system could be sensory or motor, and so sensory is bringing information to the central nervous system, and the motor division is carrying information to the effectors like muscles or glands. And we can see here that the motor division can be divided into the autonomic, which is what this chapter is about, and the somatic nervous system. Now technically the somatic nervous system is covered in Chapter 14. We actually skipped over that one. We just don't have time, but in Chapter 14 it actually covers the somatic motor division, but there's also a somatic sensory division. And so I kind of wanted to show you that sometimes this division of the nervous system can be divided in different ways. So here we have the motor divided into autonomic, which is involuntary, and somatic, which is voluntary. And then your autonomic is further split into sympathetic and parasympathetic, and that's what we're going to be looking at in Chapter 15 primarily. Now, another way that you can divide it, if you look at this division, is you can see that it's got the central and the peripheral, but then the peripheral is split into the autonomic and the somatic, and then the somatic is split into sensory and motor. So it's not that either one is wrong, it's just different resources will divide it different ways. Sometimes it's divided based on structure, sometimes it's divided based on function, and so it's essentially the same thing. It's just before we saw it sensory and motor up here, and then somatic and autonomic down here. But this right here is really what Chapter 14 is covering when it covers the somatic nervous system. It covers both the senses and how we get information to the central nervous system, like sight and taste and touch and hearing. And then you have your motor, which is, we've really kind of covered this when we covered our skeletal muscles, because it's that motor division that is taking the information to our voluntary skeletal muscles. So we're going to focus in this chapter on autonomic nervous system, which can be further divided. But I did want to give you just a little bit of review first. And so just a kind of a quick reminder of vocabulary. In the central nervous system, we have nuclei and tracts. And so nuclei are collections of cell bodies and dendrites, and then tracts are collections of axons. And so your nuclei would primarily be gray matter, your tracts would primarily be white matter. Now in the peripheral nervous system, we have the same structures, but we call them different things. So ganglia is a collection of cell bodies and dendrites, and nerves are a collection of axons. So essentially the same thing, just in different divisions of the nervous system. And so in the peripheral nervous system, the neurons can be sensory or they can be motor. It just depends on where that information is being carried. Some are going away from the central nervous system and some are going to the central nervous system. And when we look at the spinal cord, we'll see which ones are where. And we can also have a nerve plexus, which is a network of nerves that kind of come together. And we actually looked in Chapter 13 about like our brachial nerve plexus, lumbar nerve plexus, and so you may see some of these terms popping up again today. And so in Objective 1, we're just now to our first objective, but in Objective 1 we're comparing the somatic nervous system, which was Chapter 14, with the autonomic nervous system, which is Chapter 15. And so really the big difference is voluntary versus involuntary. We have control in our somatic nervous system, we make our big muscles move. Involuntary, we don't have to tell these things to happen, okay? Our digestion, things like our bladder, the release of hormones from glands, our blood vessels, our autonomic nervous system is going to control those. Now, the somatic nervous system is always excitatory. So essentially, those action potentials are going to stimulate the muscles, whereas in autonomic, they could be excitatory or inhibitory. It just depends on the signal and the neurotransmitter that effector is receiving. The somatic nervous system affects your skeletal muscles, whereas once again, we have our involuntary effectors over here. And our somatic helps us respond to the outside environment. So if we have changes, if we get scared, we want to run away, something like that. Whereas in our autonomic nervous system, we're focusing on inside changes. So our body temperature changes. It would be our response to stress in terms of blood flow and heart rate and things like that. So our autonomic helps to keep us in balance, whereas our somatic helps us respond to outside changes. Now, something that we haven't come across at all, this is going to be new, but the number of neurons from the central nervous system to the effector. In the somatic nervous system, there's just one. It has a really long axon. The cell body is going to be in the central nervous system, and then the axon is going to extend all the way to that effector, which, if you remember, the effector is a skeletal muscle. So we have one cell body in the central nervous system, usually the spinal cord a lot of times, or it could be the brain. And then that axon is going to extend all the way to that skeletal muscle. Whereas in the autonomic, we're going to have two. They actually meet in the middle in a ganglia. All right, so we have what's called a preganglionic. And in this one, the cell body is going to be in the central nervous system. Its axon is going to extend, and it's going to meet up with the postganglionic neuron in a ganglia. So the preganglionic starts in the central nervous system and ends in the ganglia. The postganglionic starts in the ganglia and ends at the effector. And we'll take another look at that here in a little bit. So here's just a picture to compare the two. I think pictures are great. They help us understand things a little better. So here is in your somatic nervous system, there's the cell body, and you can see that axon goes all the way to that muscle cell. Whereas here we have this middleman, we have this ganglion. And in the case of the autonomic nervous system, this is your preganglionic neuron. You can see that it starts in the nervous system and ends in the ganglia. And then here's my postganglionic. It starts in the ganglia and ends at the effector. Okay, this is just the same picture over here, just a little more detailed. All right, some more differences between the two. In the somatic nervous system, all of your ganglia are in the central nervous system. And then in the autonomic nervous system, the ganglia could be in or out. Okay, so the peripheral nervous system is what has your ganglia, but pretty much they are going to be located, those cell body collections are going to be located within the central nervous system. Whereas in the autonomic, like we saw, we could have some that are outside. Now, as we go through our lesson, we're going to talk about chain ganglia, and we're going to talk about terminal ganglia. There's also another type called collateral, which is in front of the vertebra column. But we will see these popping up again, so just know that there's different types. The neurotransmitters are a little bit different. When we're stimulating muscles, it's always going to be acetylcholine. We saw that in the steps of a muscle contraction. It was always acetylcholine that was being released into the synapse and binding to the muscle cell. And then with your autonomic nervous system, it could be acetylcholine. It could also be epinephrine or norepinephrine. And another name for these are adrenaline and noradrenaline. So just know that they're the same thing, just different names. And epinephrine and norepinephrine are similar compounds. The norepinephrine is lacking a methyl group, but cells that can respond to epinephrine can also respond to norepinephrine and vice versa. So they're similar enough that they're able to trigger the responses in the same types of cells. They may not have the exact same effect, but it's going to be similar. Just know that these two are the same as adrenaline and noradrenaline. Now, in terms of damage, if you were to damage your somatic nervous neurons or somatic nervous nerves, it could lead to paralysis of the muscle or atrophy, where essentially the muscles just kind of break down. Remember, if we don't move our muscles, they're going to deteriorate. And then in the nerve damage on the autonomic nervous system, they can actually still work, but they're not going to be as quick to respond. So it just kind of slows their response, and we may not maintain homeostasis quite as well. All right, and that wraps up Objective 1. We're going to pick up in the next video with Objectives 2 through 5.